So I wanted to make this video for a friend of mine who's asking a very good question about the nature of God's character, and that question is God a narcissist? And it's a really good question because at the face of it, it could definitely seem like God is a narcissist. I mean, God pretty explicitly demands worship, and the Christian understanding of the creation of the world is that the whole creation was made, in fact, to worship God, that the worship of God is the highest good and the goal for which the entire creation was made. So if you take a God who creates the world and he creates it to be worshipped, it can definitely seem like God is a narcissist. But I really don't think God is a narcissist, and I think there are some really, really good reasons why. Some of those reasons have to do with the nature of God as being itself, and some of those answers have to do with the person of Jesus. And I think both answers are really good answers, and I think together they actually create a very, very persuasive reason to believe that God is not a narcissist. In fact, God is the opposite of a narcissist. God is God is love, right? God is love, right? So God is not a narcissist. And why is that? Well, I said there's some reasons that have to do with God as being itself. And I think what I mean by that is that we have to understand who God is. God is not a big person, okay? God is not like one of many people that exist in the pantheon of beings that exist. God is not just a really, really powerful person. God is a person. God is actually three persons, and God is very powerful, but God is not just a person. He's not just a man, and he's not just a person. He is actually being itself. He is being itself. And what that means is that he is the source of being. What that also means is that he is the source of all that is good and true and beautiful. In fact, this is what Jesus claims to be himself. He says, "I am the way and the truth." Right? So God is the truth. And that's not just a fancy way of talking. That doesn't mean that God is just truthful and that he is always honest and that all that stuff is true. But what it's really meaning, I think, is that God is truth. That God is literally truth. And I also think it's right to say that God is goodness. God is beauty. God is the source of all these things, because he is the very foundation for goodness and beauty itself. If you look at the creation and you look at all the things that have been made, and to what degree or another they have the quality of being good or beautiful, right? There are things in creation that we really value, right? We value connection, we value art, we value sex, we value all sorts of things in creation that are very good and beautiful things. But if you were to imagine what all of the good and beautiful things have in common, what is it that makes them good or makes them beautiful, you can kind of see that God is hiding behind everything that is good and beautiful, because their goodness, their beauty actually is derivative of him. So anything that is good or beautiful in the world points to God because it participates in his beauty and goodness. So we have to understand that God is goodness. God is the good. God is the highest good. God is the source of all goodness. And that's very important to understand. Keep that in mind. That's part of the answer, that God is goodness. Now, the next thing I think we can presume that is also a very important part of understanding why God is not a narcissist is that God does not need anything. God is, by definition, and according to his revelation, a self-existent being who is perfectly at peace and perfectly happy within his own being. There's no need for God to create. God does not need to create in order to be worshipped. Okay? God does not create in order to be validated. God does not need attention or validation or even worship. He doesn't need any of those things. God is a community of three persons who are in eternal harmony within themselves. There is love and friendship and joy and worship and adventure and who knows what it's like to be God. But there is absolutely no need for God to create. He doesn't need to be worshipped. He has everything that he needs within himself. So I told you that God is goodness and God is beauty, and that we also understand now that God does not need to be worshipped. So then what is this about? Well, I think we can understand the creation as an act of love. Because if we understand that God does not need creation, that God does not need to be worshipped, we have to ask, why would God create at all? And I think it's a very complicated answer, and it's a very long answer in many ways, but I think it boils down to God created the world to invite others into his joy. He created in order to share himself with others. He created to be worshipped, which is also a way of saying he created to share himself with others. Because remember, God is goodness, God is beauty. There is nothing that God has or could offer or could create that is more valuable than himself. Right? If God was going to bless his creation with goodness and beauty, he would not merely give them food and drink and safety and comfort and all the things that we want as human beings and as creatures. But he would, if he really wanted to bless his creation, he would share himself. That there would be no grander way to bless his creation than to share himself. And so God created within human beings the desire and the need to worship and really to worship him. Human beings are worship creatures. We worship by our nature. We were designed to worship the highest good, which is God. And when we fell, we pursued the worship of lesser goods, which is what being a sinner is. It's the worship of plenty other things, but not the worship of God. So we have to understand that when human beings were created, we were created with the worship of God as our aim. And that's not only for God's glory, which that is the ultimate purpose. We can get into that another time, but let's just focus on what do we get out of it, because we get a lot out of it. We get to participate in the delight and the pursuit of the highest good forever. That's what we were created for. We were created to enjoy the greatest good that there is forever. And I think that's still God's plan, but that's another video. So, God does not create us because he needs to be worshipped. He creates us to worship him because there is no greater gift that he can give than himself. And so when human beings worship God, we're actually doing what we were designed to do, and we're doing the highest thing. There's nothing better than that. To summarize this first point about why God isn't narcissistic, God is not narcissistic because God's command for us to worship him is in line with the reason for which we were created, and that reason was given to us in love. God, in effect, says, "Come, behold the most glorious thing I can give you, which is me." Now, if that sounds narcissistic, again, you have to remember what I told you before, that God is goodness. So when God says, "Come, behold the most glorious thing that I can give you," he's telling the truth. He's not deluded about his value, right? And what is a narcissist? Let's actually think about that for a second. What is a narcissist? A narcissist is a person who insists in their own mind, and even perhaps towards others, that they are the highest value, that they have value which surpasses anything else, that they should have attention, that they should have glory, they should have admiration. Now, why is that a sin? It's a sin because they're not correct about that. They don't deserve all of that. They're not the highest good. And so it's pride. It's pride in which the creature insists upon worship for itself, which is self-destructive for one. It's very self-destructive. As anyone knows, if anyone knows any narcissists, you know that they're not happy people, and they are people who are deeply insecure. The contrast between a human narcissist and God, who rightly is concerned and covetous and jealous for his own glory, is that God is correct about his claim about himself. When God says, I am the greatest, and I am the best, and I have the most to give, he's not lying. He's speaking the truth, because he is being itself. He's goodness itself. He is truth itself. So he couldn't offer you anything less than himself. So that's reason number one why God is not narcissistic. Reason number two, I think, is just as compelling, but maybe even more compelling, actually, because it's so practical and it's so incarnate, which is the person in the life of Jesus. So Jesus is God's full self-revelation. Jesus is the image of God. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the exact imprint of God's nature. So when we look at Jesus, we are in fact seeing the very character of God. We are seeing the fullness of who God is. And when you understand that, and you look at the life that Jesus lived, there is no world in which you could accuse Jesus of Nazareth of being a narcissist. And if you cannot accuse Jesus of Nazareth of being a narcissist, then you cannot accuse God of being a narcissist, because Jesus is the exact image of God. He is the perfect image of God. So how did Jesus live? Well, Jesus, who was Jesus? Jesus, who is Jesus, actually, is a better way to say it. Who is Jesus? He's still alive. Well, who is he? He's the second person of the Trinity. He is the eternally begotten Son of God. He is God. He was in the beginning, and he is to come, and he is eternal. And we know very little about the life of Jesus before his incarnation. In other words, we know very little about the eternal life of God. But we know that Jesus had a glorious existence within himself, within the persons of God, within the being of God, before he became the man of Jesus of Nazareth. Because when Jesus is praying, he makes reference to the joy and the glory that he had with the Father before the creation of the world. So who is Jesus? Jesus is a king. Jesus is an heir. Jesus is a very, very rich and powerful king. And what did he decide to do as a rich and powerful king? He decided to become poor. He decided to become powerless. He decided to become vulnerable. He decided to become a servant. So the king, who deserves all honor and glory and worship, because he is goodness and because he is beauty, remember that. That same person decided voluntarily to become a helpless and dependent infant, born into a world of sin, born into a world of death, born into a world of enemies and haters of God. He became a little infant, and he grew up to be a carpenter, a poor carpenter, and a minister with nowhere to lay his head. And he allowed himself voluntarily to be humiliated and betrayed and mocked and spit on and flogged and visibly disfigured. And he willingly subjected himself to the death of the lowliest criminal in order to save his enemies from their sin. That's who God is. God is the rich and powerful king who, if anyone in existence had a right to demand worship, he does, and he does. He is that one who became the lowest of the low to give of himself fully and completely in order to rescue his enemies from their sin. That's who God is. I don't think that we can call Jesus a narcissist. I think Jesus was the one who revealed to us the secret of self-sacrifice. Jesus is anti-narcissist. He is the self-giving one. He is the one who thinks of the lowest before he thinks of himself. And that's, if you understand that, then you understand that that's a scandal. There are other religious systems which look at that and they say that is a scandalous thing. They say that is a scandalous thing to suggest that God can become vulnerable and subject to death. And yet he did. He did. So he's not a narcissist. He's the exact opposite of a narcissist. He's the one who loved the Lord his God with all his heart, mind, and strength every second of every day of his life, and loved his neighbors as himself, unto the point of death, even death on a cross. So is God a narcissist? No, he's absolutely not. He's the exact opposite of a narcissist. He demands worship because there's nothing better he could give us than that. There's nothing better he could give us than himself. And then God is not a narcissist because he demonstrated that he wasn't a narcissist when he came and subjected himself to the humiliating death of a criminal for the redemption of his enemies. There's no greater love than that. God is love. God is not an egomaniac. God is not a narcissist. He's love. And everything he does is out of love. So, I think that answers the question pretty thoroughly. In my mind, that is an absolutely convincing pair of reasons to trust that God is not a narcissist. But you guys let me know what you think in the comments.